To say that restoration of MSMEs is at the core of restoring the Indian economy would be a huge understatement. MSMEs today are the heart of generating employment and in fact employ over 12.4 crore people. There are nearly 56 million MSMEs in India, most of them nearly 60% in rural India, and only 15% are actually registered. In this mix, how can we revive the economy as well as restore jobs at a time when MSMEs have been the worst hit in COVID-19? I'm pleased to welcome on the show Mr. CS Setty, who is the MD, Retail and Digital Banking of State Bank of India, Ashok Sehgal, who is Co-Chairman CII National MSME Council, is also joining us on the show, and Maithili Bhosramat, Consulting Editor, ET Now. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us today. Mr. Setty, let me begin by just getting your take on what we've been seeing so far. Now, it's a problem which has been well diagnosed. I would say that MSMEs are sort of the fulcrum of actually growing any kind of employment in this country in a large enough scale to bring those quality jobs and quality incomes that we've been talking about, and those have also been very badly hit. Do you see any kind of sort of green shoots or improvement in this space since the month of June, July, when the unlock began, and ever since there have been a slew of measures announced to support MSMEs? What is your take on the current situation?
Yeah, thanks Tamanna for hosting me on this panel. MSME, as you rightly pointed out, most of the MSMEs, at least those who have credit linkages, I'm not talking about those who do not have credit linkages. For instance, in SBI portfolio, where we have more than 1.6 million MSME customers in our books, more than 90% of them are micro enterprises. I think this is a point which you made. And they were the most vulnerable even pre-COVID times, right? During the COVID, obviously the first few months of the lockdown, they were badly impacted both in terms of not having enough sales. Of course, people were not coming out to buy, number one. Number two, most of these micro enterprises also have, 5 to 10 people working for them. Apart from, the entrepreneur and the family also working on the enterprise, they also engage people who are mostly, migrant labor. They all have gone back to their homes. So the lack of labor and lack of demand post lockdown lifting also had impacted these MSMEs. So one of the immediate measures, if you really remember, immediately after lockdown, State Bank of India was the first one to come out with what is called COVID emergency credit line. We said that we will not ask anyone what is your stock level, what is your sales. Anybody who has got credit limit with me, 10% of that limit will be given as an emergency line. And beyond that, what we have also taken up with the government, whether the government also supports the ecosystem by having a product which is guaranteed by the government. And see, the most important thing, because they were impacted both in terms of the operations and the losses because there were not any sales, just to make and enable them to come back to operations, restart their operation, that government had come out with, the guaranteed emergency credit line, which has been extremely useful. In fact, this is one program where public sector banks as well as private sector banks widely participated in this scheme. So the measures, while they have definitely helped those people, those companies which had credit linkages, I think the people who have not had credit linkages have also have suffered. But those people not only not banking with public sector banks or private sector banks, the NBFCs and microfinancial institutions also. We realize that they are the most important linkages, the last mile connectivity providers to the MSMEs. So
yes,
through the partial credit guarantee, through the TLTRO measures, a lot of liquidity has been infused into these NBFCs and MFIs, so that they continue to lend to these vulnerable sections. So in my view, I think when they are definitely badly impacted, but certain amount of relief has been provided by way of this immediate emergency lines which have been provided. But what would ameliorate their position is, one is the consumption demand coming back. Unless the consumption demand comes back, in fact, you would be surprised. A lot of people have been talking that many of these MSMEs have not drawn the guaranteed line, right? When we reached out to them, why are you not drawing? They said that, what do I do with this money if the consumption demand doesn't pick up? I think they're all waiting for the demand to pick up. They are conserving the cash at this moment. So hopefully with the festival season around and the labor, much of the labor coming back to the operations, I presume and I hope and fervently hope that MSMEs will be back to business.
That's a very interesting perspective. And if I was to take one part of your opening comments forward, where you spoke about MSMEs being in sort of weaker position even pre-COVID, and that's a recurring theme if you look at how COVID has impacted most sections of the economy. It has only accelerated the pain that existed. Let me go across to Mr. Sehgal and get a perspective of whether these measures have helped. Mr. Sehgal, about 15% of MSMEs are actually registered. I'm not sure how many have access to clear credit lines. And is the availability of credit enough at a point when some have seen their entire business sort of decimated? Can you give us a picture of how things stand several months after coronavirus has first hit and a slew of measures largely extending credit have been unrolled?
Yes, Tamanna. I think I begin by saying that your estimate of 15% of MSMEs being in the organized sector and taking advantage of credit is a very, very optimistic and high number. I'm sure the actual number is much, much lower than that. And Mr. Setty would probably agree with that, because what is estimated is that out of 6.5 crore MSMEs that we have, 99.5%, as much as that, is a micro sector. All right. So you're left with about 0.5%, which really is small or medium sector. And the micro sector, as Mr. Setty has said, really do not have good credit and banking linkages existing either in pre-COVID times or today. Having said that, I would particularly compliment SBI in taking the lead as being the first bank to immediately announce the credit relief which they have done. And particularly coming at a time when it was announced mandatory for industry, for SMEs or industry generally across the board, to ensure that they continue to pay wages to their employees. The immediate announcement and release of additional credit was a very, very big relief. And I think that in that SBI and in fact most public sector banks seem to have responded even faster than private sector banks. The other side of it is that out of the 3 lakh crores that the government had, let me say, budgeted for this, only about 50% or 1.5 lakh crores has actually been sanctioned. And out of that, only about 1 lakh crore has actually been disbursed, if Mr. Setty can correct me on that. 1.2, okay. So I think in a way it reflects the two significances of that. One is that, as it has been pointed out, industry is still being cautious, and they're saying just because sanctioned, we're not going to draw all the money. The second thing is that there is a lot of money which has not even been sanctioned or applied for. And I think that has two sides to it. One is that, is there a need? And the second is that, are people being cautious? I think it is a mood at this point in time where the mood is that, look, let's remain flexible. If we need the money, it's good. We know, we have confidence the government will give it to us through the various channels. And I think that's it. Having said that, I think the reason why MSMEs are so much a concern of the government and the country at large, the principal cause is that they provide maximum amount of employment opportunities within the country. The second part of that, which is the second significant thing, I think, is that part of the supply chain to industry as a whole, the base on which larger industry, etc., has to be built. But let's talk about the employment side. The recent survey carried out in the last 1 or 2 weeks by CII reveals that about more than 80% of the workers have come back on the job. And that being about 2 weeks ago, it is expected that that number may even be higher right now. That should be seen in the context of one more thing, that the overall job segmentation across the different sectors is about equal between manufacturing, trade, and services. It is also approximately equal between urban and rural. We can argue whether it's 50-50 or 40-60, but they're not very imbalanced. So if people have come back, that is excellent. I think the other thing which we're seeing is that when workers are not coming back, there's a very encouraging trend that obviously they're finding some gainful employment opportunities. And like COVID has forced all of us to rethink our way of doing work, the workers too are rethinking that and finding that overall opportunities for earning, and let me not just say employment, I think we should look at employment or livelihood is a better thing, the better, wider term that we should be looking at. They are finding opportunities to earn their livelihood at home, and they prefer that to rushing back to work in urban areas, which I always feel that the conditions in which our workers work are not the most conducive to a good lifestyle.
Sure. So we are coming back. The question is, do we exactly know how large the problem is? Maithili, here I want you to come in on the lack of concrete data. This question has been raised in the Rajya Sabha, and to this the government has said very clearly that there is no data on how many MSMEs have shut down during COVID-19 or even from earlier. If we don't know the extent of the issue, does that then make it more difficult to really address the problem? Like we said, the number of MSMEs that are actually registered, then have access to credit, and then are really taking advantage of these schemes becomes highly narrowed down.
Well, yes, what you said is very true, Tamanna, because that really is the problem of MSMEs. And as Mr. Setty and Mr. Sehgal have said, in the MSME sector, it's mostly the micro enterprises that really dominate hugely. And these are very small enterprises. In fact, one thing that the government has done is amend the definition of MSMEs, which for a very long time was defined just in terms of investment in plant and machinery, and it was completely irrelevant. So to that extent, now that you've defined it in terms of turnover, it has become much easier to kind of at least identify the MSMEs. And that has been the problem really, because lack of formalization. In India, small is not beautiful at all, because it is the small that are the most vulnerable. They were vulnerable before COVID, and now they are much more vulnerable in a time when even large corporates are suffering. So I think the lack of data is a serious problem, not just in the number of units. We really don't even have any idea of the number employed. So even the data of those employed in the formal sector, quote unquote, our data is very sketchy on that. So it is very difficult to really address the problem fully, but even if you could address it partially, and I think their successive governments, and this particular government, I must give it credit for that, has undertaken a number of measures. But the point is that these are not sufficient, because really the biggest problem really of these micro enterprises, and I'm addressing essentially micro, since they account for the maximum overwhelming share of the entire universe of the MSMEs. So the biggest problem really is lack of formalization, and that leads to lack of access to credit, to technology, to any kind of access in terms of payments, getting your payments on time, in terms of formal rules, regulations, registration, even in terms of GST. Even though you could register, the entire cumbersome way, the bureaucratic way, the number of permissions that are required, I think it's very well known that despite the improvement in the ease of doing business, on the ground, things have not really changed very much. So it's a combination of factors that works against these micro enterprises. And it will take time, I think, before we see all these efforts come to some kind of fruition. But I'm not completely despondent about it. I think we've taken a number of steps. I think now the really fear is that in the attempt to really put salve on the wounds of the micro sector, you're telling banks to lend to them, rush to lend to them, and then you might have a recurrence of a large number of MSMEs. Individually, large number of NPAs. Individually, they might be very small, but totally they might add to a very large number. And though Mr. Setty said that SBI has immediately allowed a 10% increase in the limits, the point is, have we told the investigative agencies not to ask questions when these accounts go bad, as a large number of them will?
I think that's a perfect question to throw to Mr. Setty. Is that a concern at all? While, of course, these lifelines are thrown and they're very crucial, it's mandated, that is the mood of the moment. But if these chickens come home to roost, the banks will be the ones holding all the troubles.
I would like to disagree with Maithili on that front. There are two counts. One is that ultimately how we are reaching out to these customers. In fact, either the COVID emergency line what we have given or the emergency line what the government has guaranteed, both of them are aimed at supporting my existing customers, right? If I don't give additional financing, my own exposure will go into drain. So that was the philosophy behind extending this facility. And another way of looking at it is how do you deliver that? For instance, in case of guaranteed emergency line, we have not given any discretion to the operating people. We know that pretty well people will start thinking about, if I give this 20%, 10% additionally, when the loan goes bad, what happens to me? We said, you don't bother, you don't worry about it. So as an MD of, the MSME in charge, I sat with my IT team. We fished out, from the database what I have, 1.6 million customers of MSME, who are all the eligible customers. And we have generated the sanction letters from Mumbai and have made this sanction letter available in the computer at each branch. They only have to take the printout and sign and give to the customer. So you need to structure your delivery mechanism. Yes, there would always be apprehensions at the operating level. What would happen to me and what would have happened when the questions are asked when the loan goes bad? So we need to, I personally believe, I think MSMEs and most of these enterprises had issues of governance. And when the governance issues were there, the funds were not utilized for the purpose it was given. There was diversion of funds. When the loans gone bad, the questions were asked both to the promoter as well as to the banks. But if you actually devise a mechanism where the loans, particularly micro enterprises, obviously why the micro enterprises are not more and more banking with mainstream banks. It is pretty expensive to do this business, right? Because there's a cost of collection. The collection efficiency of mainstream banks in the micro enterprise is dismal. If the loan goes bad, there is nobody who is going after them to collect the money. So what we believe in SBI is that how do I deliver this? Lend digitally, reach out to them digitally, and have collection physically. So today, I think if these two issues are addressed, and also simultaneously, what is required, particularly I keep asking the industry bodies like CII, FICCI, MSME and bodies, that you need to develop the infrastructure, governance framework, remove the information asymmetry, make them technologically able. Because the credit is only one part of the inputs, right? And while we overemphasize the credit needs, we actually are not spending much time on the infrastructure development, educating them, consulting them, hand-holding them. So if external environment takes care of the governance issues, I think banks would be too keen to lend to them. And we personally, and we strongly believe that developing the MSMEs has a domino effect on the economy, which is good for us. I can give home loans, I can give car loans, I can give so many other loans if MSMEs do. It is in the interest of the mainstream banks that we continue to lend to them. But lending in the conventional way is not going to help. We need to find different ways of reaching out to these MSMEs. So the other thing what we are seriously looking, Tamanna, is in terms of
absolutely
how do we collaborate and co-lend. As I said, a great amount of digitally savvy NBFCs and MFIs have come in the market. How do we collaborate? Because they have issues of funding. We have low-cost funds, but we don't have the ability to reach out these micro enterprises. So how do we collaborate with them and have a co-lending models, which I'm very seriously working in terms of reaching out to the MSMEs, which you would see in the next few months that we will have a lot of arrangement with NBFCs will all be there in the market. So, Maithili, I would like to correct your position that I think
that's actually...
issue of issue of the accountability and the fear of investigations can be addressed if we improve the delivery channels. That is my personal.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's I think that's a fair point, and we look forward to what some of those plans are as they evolve. I think we should speak very importantly about one other important aspect of this topic, because we're speaking about the restoration of MSMEs and hence employment. Mr. Sehgal, let me come to you on that, because here we bring in the labor laws. Now, there is an ongoing attempt, in fact, to tweak labor laws in the country, make them a little more business friendly, and the hope is that this will push MSMEs to hire even more, will make it easier for them to bring more people on board, to formalize their labor contracts. I want to get your take on this. Are labor laws really an issue at this point?
I think labor laws have always been an issue because of the complexity of the labor laws. The new labor codes and the revisions being made are certainly a good step forward in giving more freedom to industry, which includes the SMEs, to take on more workers when they see an increase in business, and be assured that if there is a downturn, they can let go of those workers without suffering lifelong commitment to provide them employment, which is what was there earlier. But at the same time, a little bit of disappointment that I have is that the structure of the labor laws has remained a very complicated and complex structure with many, many pages, many, many clauses, many, many compliances. So the simplification that could have accompanied the concept of liberalization of the practices has been a missed opportunity to my mind. Having said that, I think overall the impact is positive. People will go forward and hire with more confidence. And I think overall the feeling is that, you see, as we talk of the organized and unorganized sector, the differences between the two will become less and less, and people will no longer be shy of getting into the organized sector. I think that's one of the side benefits of this COVID crisis, as Ms. Shetty has mentioned in a different context, that people who were not in the organized sector felt themselves left out of many of these schemes that were put forward by the government. I think the COVID has shown that people who come into the mainstream, who get into the organized sector, register themselves, provide the data on GST and income tax returns, etc., like in the 59-month loan scheme, makes life easier for the banker. But at the same time, it also makes people realize that if you're doing all those things, you may as well get organized in other areas, and it's not so difficult to do. And towards that end, I think technology needs to be even more harnessed, which has been touched upon again by Mr. Shetty. And we in CII particularly mentioned that the association need to take a step in this direction. We had a Money Mobility Week with support of many banks, including, of course, SBI. And we had something like 3,000 proposals channelized through that within a period of about 2 weeks. And a lot of them have fruitified into results of sanctioned things. But the role CII was playing was to bring people together and make them understand what is the requirement of an organized bank to be able to lend and to be able to consider the application. And you cannot just go to a bank and say, I need money. You have to have the paper trail, you got to have your data, and then the bank is more comfortable in lending and can lend more confidently. Of course, it's the other question was about the NPAs, which Natalie mentioned. Sure. I think the credit guarantee scheme of the government of India on the emergency credit line really has taken away the risk of that from the banks at least, although for the country it remains as a risk as a whole.
You know, I think if we look forward, and Maithili, let's talk about where we're going from here. So we're seeing this scheme of rural resurgence, and most of your MSMEs are falling in these rural areas. One hope is that the rural resurgence will also lift these smaller companies in a much larger way. The second is, as Mr. Shetty mentioned in the beginning of this show, that a festive demand will kick in. Is that really the only way? Restoration of demand in the economy, which can then lift all boats, including the MSMEs.
Well, certainly, I think if the economy kickstarts once again, then it would certainly help all sectors, especially the MSMEs, which are the most vulnerable. But I don't think it's going to happen overnight, Tamanna, so we'll have to live with a period of pain. And I think to a point that Mr. Sehgal raised in a question on employment, yes, the government's attempts to simplify the labor codes and consolidate the labor laws and make them a little easier is important. But along with that, I think not sufficient attention has been paid to the entire issue of social security. We don't have a social security network in this country. And that explains the entire process of why we saw that huge migration from the urban centers into the villages, and now people coming back desperately because there's nothing very much for them in the villages. So I think we need to address the entire issue and at the same time try to help these MSMEs, especially if it is mostly the micro enterprises that we're talking about, to formalize, give them access not only to credit, access to technology, better infrastructure, a whole host of things. So these are essentially family enterprises. And though Mr. Setty talked about digital delivery and tying up with NBFCs, etc., I think delivery is only one part of it. Ultimately, if you want your money back, these MSMEs have to become viable. If they have to become viable, they need to have access to a whole host of things which they don't have today. And though the model of banks lending through NBFCs and microfinance institutions might be a good idea, we have in fact seen how the nexus between banks and NBFCs can work out to the cost of both banks and NBFCs. So I think it's a complicated problem and we cannot expect miracles overnight, but to the extent that you keep chipping away at the problem little by little, I think we will see light at the end of the tunnel. So that really is our hope. Because if we look at employment in terms of capital cost, the answer really for a country like India is in the MSME sector, which generates an enormous amount of employment with a relatively low level of capital in a country which is capital scarce. So the answer really has to be to keep at it until one day we do achieve success.
All right, we'll end it on that positive note with the hope that, demand will come back and the MSMEs will flourish. But the idea is to get them back on the feet right now. If you have a patient in a coma, administering Glucon-D will not really help, and perhaps MSMEs right now need that jolt. We also need to identify how deep the problem is. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the show this evening.